In the annals of American history, where bold figures and dramatic events dominate, some characters blend quietly into the shadows, waiting for their stories to be told. Today we're shining a spotlight on one such figure, President Zachary Taylor, a Virginia native who rose to national fame as a war hero, only to have his tenure as president cut tragically short under mysterious circumstances. Joining us to find out how is Michael Cohen. Michael is a historian and curator of the Zachary Taylor correspondence at American University's Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to American History Gazette, Michael.
Thank you, Jake. It's great to be here.
Old, rough, and ready, the war hero turned president. He was born in Virginia to kind of a prominent family. So just tell me what his early life was like.
Taylor was born in Virginia in Orange County, but he only lived there very briefly for the first 8 months of his life. His parents were planters in the eastern area of Virginia, but at the time he was born, they were in the process of moving to Kentucky, onto some new land in the Louisville area that his father had acquired as a kind of reward for his service in the Revolutionary War. So his father had headed off to Kentucky. His mother was on the way there, but as she was late in her pregnancy, she stopped at a relative's home, Montebello, and stayed there until she gave birth, and then for an additional 8 months. So then she and Zachary and his two older brothers moved on to Louisville. So he spent most of his childhood in the Louisville area on this estate called Springfield. The house is still standing there. It's still a private residence. And he was part of this fairly prominent local planting family. They would grow cotton and enslaved a large number of African Americans on that property and eventually others in Kentucky. So he became sort of a child of the Western elite. This was at the time the Western frontier, even though we don't think of Louisville as quite that. It was at the intersection among white America and indigenous areas, as well as I said, a lot of black people living there enslaved on the plantations.
Yeah, and it was at that intersection of Native American land and the settlers encroaching on that land, and it was kind of a battleground area for the American Indian Wars at that time. And I'm sure he saw a lot of things with Native Americans and kind of brutality and violence. So did kind of the things he saw, the terrible things he saw, contribute to contempt towards Native Americans? Or was he kind of, taken back and kind of shied away from the violence? He didn't like the violence. Or did it contribute to contempt for Native Americans?
Throughout his life, Native Americans were a big part of the communities he was involved with, and I'm sure we'll get to that as we discuss his military and presidential careers later. When he was in this area of Louisville, we don't have a lot of records of what his experiences were there, and though he later would comment about his early life in some of his letters, we don't have a very clear statement of what he learned from that period. What we do know is that he would encounter Native Americans at times. This isn't an actual encounter, but one kind of odd story is one of his neighbors was a woman who it was believed had been kidnapped by a Native American group and had her hair shorn off and her scalp harmed. So she would kind of scare the local children by taking off her hat and showing them her injured head, her injured scalp. I haven't seen anything where Zachary commented on this, so I don't know what his thoughts were, but apparently some of the children were rather scared, and that would have an impact on their ideas about Native Americans. Later, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but when Zachary Taylor did join the Army, he did that just about a year after his older brother William did. William, he was, in this sense, probably an inspiration for Zachary, but he also had a very short military career and a very short life. It was less than a month after Zachary joined him in the Army that William was killed, apparently in a skirmish with Native Americans in the Memphis area. We don't know the details of this event or who exactly was involved, but that's the best estimate of why William died so early. So that would have had likely an impact on Zachary's views of Native Americans.
Yeah, I'm sure it probably wasn't a positive view on Native Americans after seeing all that, especially with his brother dying. But you mentioned he joins the army. He joins the army in 1808. Kind of walk me through how he found his way into the army from, a prominent family.
He probably was influenced by both his brother, who had served so recently, and his father, who was a rather celebrated veteran of the Revolutionary War. As I said, that's how they got their start, sort of their rise in economically, how they got the land in Kentucky. Uh, so, given that family history and the ability to continue to be a planter as an absentee, leaving to serve in the army didn't prevent him from continuing to own plantations, which eventually his father gave him one, and he acquired several others later in his life. So he could carry on this kind of dual careership as absentee planter and active soldier. Uh, 1808, at this time, the army was kind of ramping up for a potential conflict with the United Kingdom, what eventually became the War of 1812. So that's one reason why William and Zachary would have been among many people who were encouraged to join the army at that time.
Prior to the War of 1812, which we'll get into next, he attended to his personal finances and grew plantations to have over 100 slaves. Were these plantations that he inherited? You mentioned he inherited one from his father. Was this just the one he had at that time, or was he really starting to build out his plantation portfolio and build up all these slaves, over 100?
It was a gradual process. In 1810, he acquired his first plantation. That's when he married Margaret Makel Smith Taylor. And as a sort of wedding gift, his father gave him this several hundred acre plantation in Kentucky. And over the next several decades, he would buy and sell various land plots in Kentucky and later in Mississippi and Louisiana. It was in 1842 that he acquired his largest one of all. Around the same time, he sold three smaller plantations. He bought one called Cypress Grove in Jefferson County, Mississippi, near a town called Rodney that no longer exists. And it was around that time that the number of enslaved people he claimed ownership of reached up to 100. And by the time he died in 1850, just a few years later, he was the enslaver of 136 people, not counting an additional 62 he had bought for his own son. So it was a gradual process. He was, in some ways, by the economics of the time, he was successful in that he was able to acquire this more and more land, better and better land, and ownership over more and more black people. He would still often complain in his letters about how things weren't going so well. His plantations later on were in the Mississippi River area, and they would have regular floods that often would destroy the crops, which would be a problem for him and for the people actually living on the plantation doing the work. His achieving the level of land ownership and ownership of human beings that you mentioned, it did take a while. But once he got there, it put him in the kind of elite of the elite. He may not have been the largest enslaver in the South or the largest landholder in the South, but I believe 95% of enslaved African Americans lived on farms with fewer than 20 enslaved people, whereas he had over 100 on one plantation at times. This is really the exception. So he was a very wealthy man.
I think this is an important question to ask because, especially for a future president and someone with the kind of power and decision making that he had, what was his stance on slavery? Because it's easy to look now in hindsight and say that slavery was an evil practice, which of course it was. But at the time, it was a much more complicated issue for these guys. I mean, there was a lot that were not necessarily pro-slavery. Like, I know Washington and Jefferson didn't really like the practice of slavery, but they still owned slaves. It was a very complicated issue at the time. So despite Taylor owning slaves, was he, gung-ho pro-slavery, or was he kind of hesitant about the practice?
Well, as with so many things, the answer is it's complicated, but the short answer is he was very much a supporter of the institution of slavery. Um, there, uh, there's no evidence that he had any personal objections to it in a moral sense, or that he discussed, as many politicians and others did, the idea that hopefully slavery will go away someday. And Millard Fillmore, who eventually became Taylor's vice president, he would write in his letters that he didn't like slavery, hoped it'll go away someday. Taylor did not. And in fact, when he was prominent general, he would exchange letters with his son-in-law, a man named Jefferson Davis, and in these letters would discuss his views about not so much slavery as a moral issue, but the political issues surrounding slavery, this debate over whether it should be continued and whether it should be expanded into new areas as the U.S. was acquiring more land in the West. And in one of these letters in 1847, he wrote to Jefferson Davis that he really thinks people should calm down and discuss this reasonably, be willing to listen to each other, and find a compromise. But, he said, if they can't, if those Northerners who are opposed to slavery get too firm in their opinions, they become too anti-slavery, then this union won't be worth preserving, and it'll be time for us to break it, and if we have to take up arms, we'll even do that and break up the Union. He was writing this 14 years before the Civil War to Jefferson Davis, who would eventually become the Confederate president. Now, when he was president, Zachary Taylor took a very strong unionist stand, that he wanted to preserve the country, and he got annoyed with people who were too sort of pro-slavery, willing to set aside not include anti-slavery people in the Union. He actually became an ally of William Henry Seward, a New York politician who was very anti-slavery, and I'm sure we'll get to this later, but as president, he was very much open to excluding slavery from some new parts of the country. But before that, he was very clearly a very pro-slavery person, not open to really giving things up in terms of policy to those who thought that the institution was a moral wrong. I should also add that in his letters to family members, to his daughter and to the overseer he employed to operate Cypress Grove Plantation, he would write about the enslaved people there, and he sometimes expressed concern for them. He would say that a particular person, Will or Charles, he would give them their first names, that he had heard he was ill and he wanted to make sure a doctor came, and he would write to the overseer, be sure to give them enough food, they should be well fed, I want them in good health, that's very important for the plantation, and whether this came from a genuine concern for them as people who deserve to be treated well, it's impossible to get inside his mind. Clearly, part of it was the economic reasoning. That was the case for all enslavers. It was to his benefit to have the people who were growing cotton for him, making him his fortune, in good health. To have them live long lives as they could while doing this work. There may be some aspects to him there where he at least was wanted to treat them better than some enslavers did, but he didn't question the principle that he had every right to own these human beings as chattel property.
Interesting. So most definitely a complicated matter when it came to Taylor. I think it's quite interesting that he kind of foreshadowed the Civil War over a decade prior, and you mentioned how once he was in office, he was kind of a unionist, wanted to keep the Union together. I think that maybe after seeing all these military conflicts and all this violence throughout his military career, he had kind of matured and changed his mind by the time he got to the presidency. But backtracking back to his early career, the War of 1812 does break out. So what's his role in the War of 1812, and how does it play out from his perspective?
Well, he had entered the Army as a first lieutenant. By the War of 1812, he was a captain, so a low-level officer. But he actually got some fairly significant jobs during the War of 1812. The most significant one was at the beginning of the war. He was in command of Fort Harrison in Indiana. There, it was kind of on the frontier again. He spent lots of his life and his career on these frontiers between white settlements and Native American areas. This was one of them. And we often think of the War of 1812 as a conflict between the British and the Americans, and it was. But as with the Revolution, indigenous people were very much involved. And in this case, most of the indigenous groups were allied with the British rather than the Americans. So his goal at Fort Harrison was to protect it not from British troops, but from Native Americans. And a coalition of several Native American peoples did attack the fort in the first year of the war, 1812. And he was given great plaudits for having defended it, which meant both sending troops against the Native American fighters and also assigning them to duties to put out the fires that the natives had set on parts of the fort. So he was successful. That was one of the few significant land battles, for lack of a better word, that the Americans did win in that war. So it really helped his career, made him sort of look good to the Army and to the establishment in Washington. Then after that, he had some less significant and varied jobs in the war. For much of 1813, he was actually on leave. They didn't have anything they needed him to do. He applied twice to be transferred to the Eastern Front so he could be where the more significant battles were happening, but those transfers were denied.
Interesting. And the War of 1812 comes to a conclusion, and he resigns from the Army, but joins up again a year later. So what was his thought process behind that?
It had to do with rank. At the end of the War of 1812, the Army was reduced. They had expanded it to fight this war, to get ready for it and fight it. And now that they're back in peacetime, there are constant conflicts going on between whites and Native Americans. But the U.S. was no longer in a declared war with a foreign European power. So they reduced the size of the Army significantly. And most people at similar sort of levels of the Army as he were let go. They didn't need them anymore. He was one of the fortunate ones. Kind of, he was given the compliment of being kept on in the peacetime Army, but because it had been reduced by so much, his rank was being reduced. He had been promoted to major near the end of the war, and they said, now you can stay on, but we're reducing your rank to captain. That apparently was not good enough for him, and he resigned his commission. A year later, they offered him a new job as major again, so he returned to the Army. And that was the only break in an Army career of over 40 years.
Interesting. So it was kind of like a political move, more so than he just wanted to leave the Army. But it's during this time he moves to Baton Rouge, gets Plantation there, and then he's called into action again for yet another skirmish with the Native Americans, and this is referred to as the Black Hawk War. So what was the Black Hawk War, and how did Taylor, what was his role in that?
This is a couple decades later. We're now in 1832, and I'm sorry, 1835. In the 1830s, the United States had begun a project that we call Indian removal. It was the principle officially initiated by Andrew Jackson when he was president, but in some sense had been going on even before that white people wanted to acquire more and more of this land that Native Americans had lived on for generations and considered themselves considered to be their own land. So the United States took on this formal goal in the 1830s of removing all Native Americans from the land east of the Mississippi. So they would sign treaties, as they had been doing before this, with Native American groups to say, we'll give you this land that we claim ownership of way in the west where we're not doing anything. You can have that land, we'll in exchange take your land in the east where we actually want to be, and we want to make it into farmland. The Native Americans were very often pressured to sign these treaties, and even once they were signed, the U.S. government wasn't very good at keeping to the language of them. They often would not provide the cash payments that they had promised along with the land. And although they had said, okay, this land west of the Mississippi, this is yours now, they didn't do a good job at policing private individual white people who wanted to take that land, especially when the indigenous men were hunting during the winter months. The white people would take advantage of that to come on, squat on the land, and effectively take it over. And I say west of the Mississippi, but this also happened with land east of the Mississippi. Whatever land the natives were given was always it was never a guarantee that they would actually be allowed to live on it and control it. So some natives understandably got upset about this enough that they took up arms against the United States. And Black Hawk was this leader of the Sauk Indians in Illinois who started this conflict. It only lasted about 3 months in Illinois and toward the end of it in Wisconsin. Taylor was one of the U.S. military officers who was sent there. He led about 300 regular troops plus some militia. And in this battle, and they fought against Black Hawk and his native supporters. The white people won. A lot of natives were killed in this war, as well as some whites. Black Hawk was he was one of the ones who managed to survive, but he had to escape west of the river out of Illinois. It was Zachary Taylor didn't actually get to do a lot in this. He was kind of frustrated that other officers were given sort of the main jobs in the war, so he wasn't involved in many major battles. But and it was considered a success by the U.S. Army, so again, it helped move him along in his career.
Yeah, just one of the tragic stepping stones along this Indian removal policy, and not the last one for Taylor. His next major conflict and major action in life was the Second Seminole War down in Florida and the Battle of Lake Okeechobee. So he gets called down to Florida, which is a pretty interesting piece of history to me because I'm from Florida. I'm only about an hour and a half away from Lake Okeechobee, so I plan on going pretty soon to make a video about it. But he gets called down to Florida for the Second Seminole War, another Native American skirmish. And it was actually one of the largest U.S. Native American battles and conflicts of the entire 19th century. And it is where he earns his infamous name, Old Rough and Ready. So kind of walk me through the Second Seminole War and how that played out down there.
Sure. To start with the larger context, the United States had officially acquired Florida in 1821 through an agreement with Spain. But that didn't mean that either the Spanish people or the American people were in charge of it. A lot of it was controlled by the Seminole native people, and they knew the geography very well. Much of their land was in a swampy area, as so much of Florida is, so it was very hard for the white armies, whether it be Spain or the U.S. or anyone else, to dislodge them from that area as much as the white people wanted to take their land and wanted to just establish their own government over the area. So between the 18-teens and the 1850s, there were three of what the Americans called the Seminole Wars, first, second, and third. All of these were attempts to take that land and get rid of the Seminoles. Eventually, by the Civil War, a lot of the Seminoles had been removed from there and sent, as with many other Eastern Native Americans, to what's now Oklahoma, what they called Indian Territory. Taylor was part of this. In the Second Seminole War, They went through several commanding U.S. officers. Winfield Scott, famous, very successful military officer of the time, was one of them. And he, like the others, were total failures at this particular war. They just were not able to get any kind of successes against these natives who generally didn't fight in what the types of battles that the white people were used to in these pitched battles. Rather, it was what we might call guerrilla warfare, or taking advantage of the territory, of the swamps, of the geography that the people living there actually knew, and the white people had trouble finding them, let alone fighting them or defeating them. So they brought in Taylor in 1837. And he was the most successful of the U.S. generals in the Second Seminole, not generals, but U.S. officers in the Second Seminole War. He actually was given promotion as a brevet general because of this. That doesn't mean he actually really won the war, but he managed to win, as he said, this one big battle. It was one of very few real pitched battles in the war. But the Seminoles had set up this kind of line of defense near Lake Okeechobee. They had some trouble defending it because they were divided amongst themselves. I mean, the Seminole were a loose collection of groups organized in different political structures. So they had this kind of defensive line, but three different parts of it were led by three different officers under three different command structures. So they didn't communicate very well. So Taylor was able to lead U.S. troops against them and managed to take this bit of land around Lake Okeechobee. I believe 23 Americans died in this. 11 Seminoles are believed to have died, though the numbers we have for the Seminoles are much less accurate because our records are from the white military. So it was a loss in the sense of men dying for Taylor's army, but they did manage to get this land. The actual Seminole people, I mean, they weren't expelled or anything. They just went off into other areas that they knew where the whites couldn't find them. So it was emblematic of the type of warfare going on down there, but the U.S. government was happy to celebrate anything that looked like a victory. It made Taylor look like this very, very effective officer compared to the others who hadn't achieved even that type of battle success. So he was given his first brevet to promotion as a brigadier general.
Would you consider this as Taylor's breakout role? Because you mentioned he had success and the higher ups kind of saw that and he's like, oh, he's a capable officer. We're going to promote him to general. Was this his breakout role to kind of move him into that echelon of elite military commanders in the U.S. Army at the time?
You could see it that way. I mean, I guess it depends on what you're looking for in a breakout role. If you mean in terms of becoming a general, having the rank to be one of the highest, the officers who are sort of given command of the largest forces, then yes. In terms of his popularity, probably the Fort Harrison defense, though it was much earlier in his career and it certainly didn't make him a general, he was far from that. It is the first one that made both people in Washington, people in the military, and even some just American citizens watching the news sort of start paying attention to him. And I should also mention, you had brought up his nickname, Old Rough and Ready. As you said, that emerged during the Second Seminole War. His troops were the first ones who would call him that because, I mean, the ready part comes from his being ready to fight. He was willing to go into battle, and he would go into battle with his soldiers. He didn't like to hang behind and just send them off to do the work. He liked to command from the front, so he would take part in the risks of the wars that he fought. And his soldiers really appreciated that, so it built a good rapport between them. The rough part was from his dislike of formality, dislike of uniforms. He tended to dress in sort of the same types of clothing that his soldiers would be wearing. He wouldn't wear a formal officer's uniform most of the time. So sometimes officers subordinate officers or soldiers would show up, and he would be their commander. If they hadn't seen him before, they'd encounter him like doing some little manual job, and they wouldn't know who he was. So that created some funny stories in the news. And another of those funny stories, this comes later from during the Mexican-American War, which I'm sure we'll get to. He, at one point, had a meeting with David Connor, who was the admiral commanding the Navy in the area. He knew that David Connor was a very formal, very officious man. So he broke from his usual tradition and he put on his formal dress uniform so that he could pay respect to this admiral. Well, the admiral had heard that Taylor didn't like formality and didn't like uniforms, so he came in street clothes. So they met each other, each kind of outfitted as the other usually would be, and had a good laugh about it.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. I think if you ever look at a picture of Taylor, you can kind of make out the rough part. You know, he's always got the disheveled hair. He's wearing his uniform in pictures, but he definitely looks like a rough character, which, yeah, and I think it's probably one of the most infamous nicknames in presidential history, even though his presidential tenure was only a year. Definitely one of the most infamous names. But that concludes, and his next major conflict is arguably the largest of his entire career, really sets the stage for his national fame. And this is the Mexican-American War, which kind of starts under Polk's administration and is over, Texas claims its independence. The U.S. wants to annex Texas. Mexico wants it. So this war breaks out. So kind of how did the Mexican-American War break out, and what was going on between Mexico and America?
Yeah, you gave just the basics there, so I'll expand on that just a little. In the 1820s, Mexico had fought a war against Spain for its own independence, and they established the independent nation of Mexico. But Mexico was a lot bigger than what we think of as Mexico. It was twice as big as the country today, and it included everything from Texas to California. The United States was much smaller. Well, in the 1820s and especially the 1830s, a lot of Americans started immigrating into Mexican Texas. And this was mainly southern farmers, southern white farmers. They would immigrate there, and if they owned African Americans, as many of them did, as enslaved property, they would bring them there to develop this land into new cotton plantations. They some of the more eastern land in what was actually the United States had been depleted, so they wanted to be able to move into these new areas. So they start setting up these U.S.-style plantations in Mexican Texas. At first, Mexico liked this, but eventually they decided there are too many Americans there. We wanted people to move here, but there are just too many, so they closed the border. It didn't stop them. The Americans continued immigrating illegally into Mexican Texas. Well, by 1836, the Americans there or American expatriates, I should say, had established their own government of Texas, and they declared independence from Mexico. They fought a war with Mexico, and although Mexico never admitted that Texas was an independent country, in effect, these American Texans did win. Almost immediately, they asked for annexation to the United States, because not all of them wanted this, but many of them did see this as kind of the ultimate goal. They had taken over Texas from the Mexicans, and they ignored any claim that the Native Americans there had over it, though most people in the area were Native Americans. And now they wanted to incorporate Texas into the U.S. so that they can sort of have this additional slave state or slave states as part of the United States. The U.S. government was hesitant to do this because they expected it'll lead to war with Mexico. Well, eventually, the U.S. Government did it, and it led to war with Mexico. You were right. This war began under President James K. Polk. In 1845, in 1844, Polk was elected on a pro-Texas platform. If you elect me, then we will bring Texas into the country. And because he won the outgoing president, John Tyler, told Congress this was a referendum on Texas. They voted Polk in because the voters want Texas. So he actually got the process begun, got Congress to pass a joint resolution offering Texas annexation even before his term ended in his lame duck period. And then the process continued under Polk, was finished by the end of 1845. However, sorry, am I going on too long? Oh, okay. Yeah, well, now we're getting to Taylor's involvement. In early 1846, it's clear that war is likely, that Mexico is they're cut off their diplomatic relationship with the United States, and some military forces are amassing along Texas' southern border. The U.S. and Mexico also didn't even agree on where the Texas border was. The U.S. thought it was farther south. Mexico thought it was farther north. Mexico had more of a historical backing for their claim, but there was this dispute. So early in 1846, Polk orders troops under Zachary Taylor into this especially disputed part of Texas, between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, in this disputed area that Mexico, with good reason, claims control of. Mexican soldiers fire on American soldiers, war begins, and Polk goes to Congress and convinces them to officially declare war.
Yeah, and it was during this skirmish, the Battle of Buena Vista, which is Taylor's basically crown jewel moment from the Mexican-American War. This is what really set him on the national stage and ultimately kind of set the stage for his presidency. But he goes into the Battle of Buena Vista as a major underdog, logistically in terms of numbers, and he actually ends up coming out victorious, driving the Mexican forces away. So what happened at the Battle of Buena Vista?
Well, you're right. The war in Mexico was essentially fought along two fronts. At first, Taylor was the lead general there, and all of the early fighting was along the Rio Grande. Then, a few months into the war, the Polk administration decides that they want to lead troops right into the heart of Mexico. They want to send them toward Mexico City to convince Mexico the United States is going to win this war. You don't have a chance. You have to give up and give us the terms that we're asking for, which by this time was not just an admission that the U.S. had control of Texas, but additional land. The Polk administration wanted to acquire everything between Texas and the West Coast. That is what we think of as the U.S. Southwest and California. They try to get it diplomatically, but without success. So they want to launch this new effort into central Mexico. Polk decides not to give that job to Taylor because Taylor is becoming really popular as he wins these wars, as he wins these battles along the Rio Grande, and he's being thought of as a potential politician, a potential president. And he's linked with the other party from Polk's. Polk was a Democrat. Taylor was increasingly associated with the Whig Party. So Polk doesn't want to sort of give this job and potential glory to a political enemy, so he instead assigns it to Winfield Scott, who is the top general in the army at the time. So Scott takes most of Taylor's troops and leads them into central Mexico. They have an amphibious assault in Veracruz, then head toward Mexico City. Taylor, meanwhile, continues with this fraction of his troops from earlier, fighting these battles along the Rio Grande, and Buena Vista is the one where he fights against Mexican troops who, as you said, vastly outnumber him. But through a series of kind of sort of really lucky events, as well as his and his subordinates' good decisions, and the fact that many of his troops were now regular troops, either regular troops or volunteers for the war who had had some experience in the earlier battles, he was able to pull out a kind of messy win at this place called Buena Vista. in which the U.S. Lost a lot of soldiers, and it wasn't a decisive win. It didn't do great damage to the Mexican army, but they did manage to hold the area. So it was seen as a great success, given the small number of the small force that he had, and with good reason. And he, in many of his letters after that, he bragged about it, comparing himself with what the administration expected. He said they thought that they were going to ruin me, that they'd taken all my force away, that I could never achieve anything. But look at Buena Vista. And that really did, as you said, launch him in his sort of national popularity that led him to be a presidential candidate in 1848.
Yeah, you mentioned all these battles that he's winning, really just increasing his popularity nationwide, and there were some serious talks beginning to go on that this could be, a good presidential candidate. But he didn't necessarily want the presidency, did he?
He wrote over and over in letters he did not want to be president. That he occasionally would give a reason for this. He would say that he spent 4 decades in the army, more than that, and he wanted to have an easier job in the army once this war was done, just be in command at some fort where he can relax a little more, or he'll just retire to his plantation. He wants to spend more time with his family. In at least one letter, he wrote that he didn't think it was appropriate for a general to become president. He didn't think a military officer should be the U.S. president. He wrote in many letters that he didn't feel he was qualified to be president. At that time, the U.S. had never had anyone be president who hadn't served in political office before, civil political office. It was the generalship was not seen by many politicians as a path to the White House. And since then, we've had several people who were known as generals become president, but up till then, although Washington and Jackson and others had been generals, they'd also had elected or appointed political office. And Taylor hadn't. He even pointed out that he had never voted in his life. This was largely not his fault. And before the Civil War, almost no states offered absentee ballots, even for soldiers. So most people in the military assigned anywhere besides their actual place of residence didn't have the ability to vote. And then in many other letters, he just said, "I've never sought this job. I don't want it. I'm not a politician." And particularly that his children and his wife did not want him to be president. Forgive me again for getting ahead of myself, but one story that made the rounds in the newspapers after he was elected was that he had in the streets of I think it was New Orleans, might have been Baton Rouge, but he was walking around the streets and someone came up to him, not knowing who he was, because there was no television, very limited photography. People didn't know what politicians looked like back then. This person, just thinking he was some random stranger in the street, asked him, "Who did you vote for?" And Zachary Taylor said, "Well, I did not vote for General Taylor because my wife is strongly opposed to his election." And this may have been a joke. It may have been a true story. It may have been Taylor's own joke, but the story was told in some papers.
That's pretty funny. That's really funny. But it sounds like he's almost quoting Washington verbatim when Washington was in his shoes as a general with very high popularity around the nation, and he was kind of hesitant as a military leader going to office. He didn't think he was qualified. He wanted to retire home to his plantation. It sounds pretty much exactly like what Washington was saying, which I thought was something interesting.
It does, and not necessarily in this particular context, but in others, he did write about how much he venerated Washington, Jefferson as well. Those were two of his favorite early presidents, and he said that if he did become president, if the people by their own choice elected him against his wishes, then he would model his activities after those of the early presidents, of which he probably meant mainly Washington and Jefferson.
Yeah, but the political ball gets rolling. for Taylor, and despite his concerns and worries, it really doesn't stop, and he really starts building momentum. A lot of people are campaigning for him, and he's not necessarily campaigning himself. So he ends up winning the election, but how does he win the election where he's not really campaigning himself, doesn't really want the presidency?
There are a couple of parts of that. One, related to what we were just talking about, is although I haven't found evidence that he was lying when he said he didn't want to be president. Ironically, his saying that may well have helped him to become president, because, and you're right, it draws that connection with Washington. People at that time would see it too, that he's this person who doesn't have any great love of power. He's not trying to pull one over on us or just get power for himself. He's someone who's willing to serve his country. And as his early letters say, I don't ever want to become president. His later ones say, I don't want to become president, but if the people choose me, then I will serve. So that attitude probably helped him writing these letters, some of which were meant to be public, some of which weren't, but either way, often they ended up published in newspapers. That helped him help build up his reputation as someone who was committed to the Union, committed to the American people, and would make a good president. More generally, though, the question of his not campaigning, that was actually the norm back then. Until the very late 19th century, candidates for the presidency did not campaign themselves. It was considered kind of unseemly. If you were a presidential candidate, then it was beneath you to go out and ask people to vote for you. So instead, other people in the party would do the campaigning for them. In his case, local politicians in the Whig Party. Abraham Lincoln, who was in Congress around this time, he was one of those who campaigned for Taylor. He was a big supporter. So it was, the party structure, not the candidate who would do the campaigning. To the extent he did any campaigning, like other candidates, it was either through writing those letters that were published in newspapers or through welcoming people who just came to see him at his house, what later would become known as a sort of front porch campaign. On a less formal basis, it had been done earlier where if someone came to his house, then sure, he'd be happy to talk with them. But he generally would refuse to give his opinion on any political issues, either in the letters or in person.
Yeah, he was definitely known for that apolitical kind of shying away from really committing to a side. So he ultimately wins the election of 1848. And Polk was known, like you mentioned earlier, to have not liked him. They were from opposing political parties, and he wanted to suppress his fame. So how was the transition between Polk and Taylor as political adversaries?
The transition was much less elaborate back then than it is now, and partly because the presidency was a smaller and, outside of wartime, less important office, and Congress had much more authority relative to the president than it does now. The United States as a nation was much less powerful on the world stage than it is now, so the presidency didn't carry quite as much weight as it does today, and the White House staff was much smaller. So, really, the president's staff consisted of only two people, the president and his private secretary, who was often a relative. In Polk's case, it had been his nephew. Taylor had his son-in-law as his private secretary. So the transition was really just two people leaving, two people coming. It wasn't eleborate. The interesting interaction we have between Polk and Taylor is something that Polk recorded in his diary on Inauguration Day. One of the great things about Polk, before I worked on Taylor and Millard Fillmore, I was working on Polk, is he kept this great diary for most of his presidency where he gave detailed accounts of what he did each day. And for that day, after the inauguration, well, both before it and after it, he rode with Taylor in a carriage to and from a hotel. Well, they had a brief conversation in the carriage. I mean, they were cordial, and Polk had invited Taylor to a dinner when Taylor first arrived in Washington, so they weren't openly hostile toward each other. But in this carriage ride, according to Polk, Polk had brought up the idea, or one of them had brought up the idea of California. And Taylor said that he didn't think that California, though it had been acquired by the U.S., would ever really become part of it. It was just too far away. It couldn't get incorporated into this country. It wouldn't be very important. So probably the West Coast would just separate off and be its own country. And Polk commented in his diary that he thought this was rather ignorant, and he hoped that Taylor would think this through further and see the benefit of California. Then he said more generally that he seems like a nice old man who wants to do good, but he seems very ignorant, he's uneducated, and just seems of very mediocre capacity. He did not have a strong opinion of Taylor, but again, Taylor was the elected president, so he didn't say anything publicly against him.
It seems like he definitely didn't have a very, very high praise for Taylor in those writings.
And to be fair, I should say Taylor didn't think much of him either. And when he was in Mexico, he didn't think Polk was treating him well. Once, when he was in Mexico, he had heard a report that Polk had died. And he wrote to his brother, I think it was, that he'd heard this report, and he said he didn't believe it was true, and it wasn't true, and Polk was still very much alive through his term. But he went on to write to his brother, I do not wish to hear of the death of any man, but there is no one in the Union whose death would have set me less than his.
So yeah, they definitely had some backdoor contempt for each other. But Taylor comes into office, and really the hot debate in America at the time was what to do with all this new land acquired from the Mexican-American War. Like you mentioned earlier, it was Texas all the way to California. It was a huge chunk of land. And the big question at the time was, are we going to bring slavery into these territories, or are they going to be incorporated as, free states without slavery? So this was a very hot debate at the time in America that Taylor had to deal with after stepping in office. So how did he deal with that?
You're exactly right. That was the big question. This land previously had been part of Mexico, and Mexico had abolished slavery. They banned slavery everywhere except Texas and one other small area farther south. So most of this new land was, at the time, free territory. But in the U.S., it wasn't an exact split, but generally northern politicians wanted to maintain it as free territory west of Texas, and most politicians from the South wanted to allow white people to bring in enslaved black people and establish plantations or use enslaved black labor for other purposes, including mining for gold in California. Just around the time the U.S. acquired California, gold was discovered there. Taylor has to deal with this, and he's working to some extent with Congress on figuring out what are we going to do with this land. And his plan is not what we would expect from a major Southern slaveholder. He was open to, in fact, supportive of excluding slavery from this land. Part of his reasoning was this commitment to union, that he was willing to work with Northerners. And as I said, William Henry Seward, an anti-slavery New Yorker, became a big influence on his administration, was very much an ally. They were both Whigs. So he worked with Seward to develop his plan for the West. Also, as Taylor wrote, he didn't think that slavery was really practical in the West. He's not saying that slavery is morally bad, that we shouldn't have it there because of the way it treats people who are considered property. He was saying that the types of work out there, mining or for gold and other minerals, and the limited types of agriculture the area was conducive to, just weren't appropriate for plantation-based, race-based slavery and agriculture. So he said it didn't make sense. It's a moot point. Slavery is not going to take root out there, so it's fine. We should bring these in as slave states. So his plan was to to let the people out there decide. Just have like the people in California and these other areas, everything between Texas and New Mexico, between Texas and California was called New Mexico. So let the people in California and New Mexico just decide for themselves, meaning the white people there. And it was clear that those people were going to say this will be free territory, which was in large part because they didn't want white laborers didn't want to have to compete with enslaved black people for jobs. So Taylor kind of incurred the ire of other Southern slaveholders and of the Southern branch of both the Whig and Democratic parties in taking this position, and others in Congress were pushing for instead having a plan where they would allow slavery out there. This debate was going on between him and his supporters in Congress and other opponents in Congress, even with his own party, well into 1850 when he died. So he never got to see the end of this. He was not the president who ended up signing the compromise bills that settled the issue. But it was, as you said, not the only issue, but the dominating one right up to the end of his presidency.
Yeah, him taking kind of a middle-of-the-road policy really didn't make either side happy, because he wasn't hard enough on, no slavery, and he owned slaves, so the Northern abolitionists were angry at that. And then he wasn't pro-slavery. He said, well, let them decide for themselves, and they're probably going to end up not having slavery there. So that made the Southerners pretty angry, and this really started to sow the seeds of division in the country and sow the seeds of what would become a civil war. But how bad was the division escalating at that time, and what was Taylor doing about it, if he was doing anything at all?
Well, there were rumblings that a war could begin in the late 1840s and early 1850s. And during the Polk administration, during the Taylor administration, and afterwards, some people did say that this, either they feared that this would go to war or that this should go to war. I mean, I mentioned to you that Taylor himself had written to Jefferson Davis that we may need to take up arms and break up the Union. And some people continued, particularly pro-slavery Southerners, especially in South Carolina, did make statements like this. John C. Calhoun was not the most extreme of them, but he was the most prominent of those who seemed potentially open to breaking up the Union. Taylor, as president, and he did become very firmly Unionist. Whether we're going to have slavery here or there or wherever or anywhere, his first priority, he did sometimes say, was to preserve the Union. That was the ultimate goal of whatever decision they made about the Western territories in 1850, from their perspective. And an instance that, insofar as anything is famous about Zachary Taylor, that became famous, was a discussion that involved another issue, kind of a border conflict between Texas and New Mexico. But he was in a meeting in the White House where, according to one account from someone who was in the meeting, someone there said, a senator, that if this isn't decided in our favor, that Texas doesn't get all the land that Texas claims ownership of, then we will go to war against the United States. We'll break off. And he said that if you do that, then I will lead troops down there myself, and I will hang the traitors more readily than I hanged those in Mexico. Now, other people who were at the same meetings had different accounts, said he didn't say that. But that is a story that eventually got out and kind of cemented his reputation as a firm Unionist, taking the position, even if it made him take a position against his fellow Southern slave owners.
Yep, that's old Rough and Ready for you. Always ready to fight, always ready to trek down there and squash the skirmish. But before he can really tackle these issues and address these issues, he comes to his unfortunate, untimely demise only a year after taking office. And I find this not well, interesting. It's unfortunate, but I do find it interesting because it's very mysterious the way he dies. At least I think so. He's at an event at the Washington Memorial on July 4th and suddenly falls very ill with, severe stomach issues and dies 5 days later, I believe, on July 9th. So walk me through how he died and kind of the mainstream narrative and conclusion that historians have come to.
The way you described it is just right. He on that day, the 4th of July, at the Washington Monument, which was still under construction, he attended the ceremony. It was a very hot day. He drank a lot of water, and afterwards he had accounts differ of what exactly he consumed, but milk and some kind of fruit, cherries, according to some accounts. And after that, he got sick, some kind of what seemed to be gastroenteritis, and died on the 9th. And the story that is most often told is that there had been something in the milk or in the cherries or other fruit that had gotten him sick. I mean, there were lots of diseases going around at the time. Medicine was in a very limited state. They could not effectively treat a lot of these illnesses, and what they did give him, which included mercury, among other things, probably just hurt his health more than it helped it. As people have looked at this and other deaths in Washington more recently, they consider that rather than the milk and fruit, it's possible that the water had been the problem. Because at that time, and Washington was more or less built in a swamp, there was very little distinction between its water and sewage systems. So there were lots of viruses and bacteria floating around in the water that people there would drink. Lots of people got sick. Sometimes they recovered, sometimes they didn't. Taylor had lost children to malaria, and he'd seen lots of soldiers in Mexico die from illnesses that they hadn't built up an immunity to. So it is entirely possible that what he got was from that water or from the milk and the fruit. We can't know exactly. There has also been speculation that he had actually been assassinated. That not that someone shot him or stabbed him, but that they'd poisoned him. And in the 1990s, actually, someone who had studied this and theorized this spoke with his family, and they had his body exhumed. I happened to be on a family trip in Kentucky at the time, so I remember hearing it on the local news there. And so they checked his body to see if they could find the chemical agent or remnant of it that would have killed him. They did not. So there's no evidence that he was assassinated, and no one claimed to have assassinated him. Like, there was no threat or claim of the deed. So it does seem that he died of gastroenteritis. What exact illness it was, we really have no way of knowing, and which of the things he consumed gave it to him, we don't know.
Yeah, so it's very plausible that he either died from too many milk and cherries or poisoned water, but it's unfortunate. I think it would be a lot more, thriller, like a movie, if he was assassinated, because it's very plausible that he was assassinated with the division in the country at the time. Southerners wanting the pro-slavery in the new territory, Northerners wanting the abolition of slavery in the new territory. So I think it's very plausible that one agent from either of the sides could have poisoned him in the thought that he wasn't doing enough to push their agenda in their new territory.
Presidents did receive death threats at the time, and I mean, I've seen some of those that Polk received. In the project I'm working on now, studying Taylor, we haven't gotten to the presidency yet, so mostly dealing with the period of the war and his election. So I haven't looked through those letters enough to find the threats. It would not surprise me at all that he received them. We don't have evidence that someone actually did this, and no one else has found a threat that they have tied to his actual death.
Yeah, it's quite interesting nevertheless, and there still does remain a question mark in the air. Obviously, science has kind of swayed towards the side of, he died from the sickness and the milk and the water, but it is interesting that it was never really confirmed and there's still a question mark in the air. But that wraps up the story of Zachary Taylor for today. Michael, I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Jake, for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. It's been fun.